My nickname is unpatriotic, and it's a horrible name to be called. But it must be a misunderstanding. That's all. The woman in front of me, struggling to find the right words, is my despised mother-in-law, Susan. Just minutes ago, Susan told me to leave the store, and I walked out in tears. After persistent calls from both Thomas and Susan, I returned to the store, where Susan, normally so quick to belittle me, looked more panicked than ever. She had just loudly told me to leave, calling me a stranger. What did she mean by that? I need an explanation. My name is Caroline, a 32-year-old office worker. I have been married to Thomas for 4 years, but we don't have any children yet. My life changed dramatically after the death of Thomas's father, Kingston. We were living in another state at the time. Kingston's sudden heart attack was a shock, and at his funeral, Thomas's uncle said to him, "You're the youngest and the only son. You'll return home eventually, right? Make sure mom feels at ease." A few months after Kingston's death, Thomas announced that he had transferred to an office near home. He already made the decision and reported it to me afterward. I protested, "Why would you decide something so important without consulting me?" To which Thomas replied, "I thought you'd object." "Sorry, Caroline," Thomas said. "I know you don't get along with my mom. It's true, I dislike Susan, and she dislikes me even more. When we lived out of state, we only visited during long vacations due to work while Susan nagged, 'Why can't you come at least once a month? It's not like you live overseas. Nancy visits twice a week, you know.'" Nancy and Tracy, Thomas's older sisters, live close to their parents. Of course, Nancy can visit twice a week if she lives nearby. Thomas defended me, saying, "Don't compare us to Nancy. We have work and flying back every time is costly." Kingston tried to mediate, so our relationship with Susan was strained but manageable. Susan's primary issue with me seems to be children. I remember last summer's visit vividly when she asked, "Why don't you have children yet?" She looked pointedly at my stomach and added, "Sorry, but Nancy doesn't have any children either. Both Nancy and Tracy married before me and also don't have children. I thought she should focus on her own daughters rather than criticize me." But Susan said, "Nancy's married off, but you're different. As a daughter-in-law, you're expected to provide a proper heir." Her outdated remarks always frustrated me. Moreover, she told me, with the low birth rate nowadays, it's better to have more children for society. You don't want to be unpatriotic, do you? Unpatriotic, I thought. Who even uses such a word? Susan's comments were strange and shocking. However, when I heard that Susan was ill, even Thomas seemed concerned, leading to our recent actions. Naturally, I was conflicted. Following Thomas meant quitting my job and, more importantly, dealing with increased interactions with Susan. I even considered asking Thomas to go alone. But then I saw a social media post from a friend whose husband had cheated on her during a business trip. After much deliberation, I decided to go with Thomas, reasoning that we wouldn't be living together anyway. Susan seemed genuinely delighted by my decision. 2 weeks later, Susan invited me for tea at her place. It was the first time I'd accepted such an unwelcome invitation, but I couldn't ignore it. When I arrived at the in-laws' house, Susan and Nancy greeted me. Seeing my two least favorite people, I already wanted to leave. "Caroline, long time no see. Why haven't you visited since moving here?" Nancy asked, her tone dripping with malice. Susan sighed. "Caroline, I was so happy you decided to move here, but it seems I was mistaken. You dislike me, don't you?" I considered saying, "Yes, I do," just to see her reaction, but of course I couldn't. "I don't dislike you, it's just that I've been feeling unwell due to the new environment," I said, which was true. I had been resting at home due to fatigue, and Thomas hadn't mentioned anything about the visit. Why was I called here today? Just to hear their nasty comments? Susan accuses me of disliking her, but isn't it the other way around? How can we possibly get along under these circumstances? Nancy snapped. "How can you speak to mother-in-law like that? Apologize to her. Say you're sorry." I thought Susan would react with anger, but her response was unexpected. "You're right, I have been mean. I'm sorry, Caroline. I'm sorry about the child comments too. I was being nosy." I braced myself for a scolding, expecting some underlying malice, but there was none. Even Nancy looked surprised. All I wanted was to hold a grandchild. Nancy's husband was infertile, and Tracy seemed to have fertility issues, so I hoped Thomas and I would be able to provide that joy. Despite knowing about Nancy and Tracy's struggles, Susan had unfairly taken her frustrations out on me. Thomas and I have discussed having children and are considering it, so please, just leave us be for now. I bowed my head slightly, but I suppose I still had a conscience. I'm sorry, I said, but do visit us sometimes, Susan replied. After that, Susan and Nancy started watching TV and having tea as if the earlier awkwardness had never happened. I like this announcer, she's so energetic and bright, Susan said, referring to her favorite local female announcer. I glanced at the TV, feeling a twinge of regret. Maybe if I had been more outgoing, things could have been different with Susan and her family. It was a silly thought, but I was glad to have shared my feelings today. Perhaps things could improve. However, my hopes were quickly dashed. That night, Thomas came home and immediately started yelling. I heard from Mom that you said you have no intention of getting along. Are you saying Mom was crying? I was bewildered. Why was Thomas reacting this way? After our conversation, he had waved goodbye with a smile, and now he seemed to be accusing me of something. Look, Thomas, it's a misunderstanding on Susan's part, I tried to explain. I told her I don't know how to be friends under these circumstances. You know about my relationship with Susan. How does that turn into me not wanting to be friends? I'm beyond astonished now. I'm just scared. Thomas completely believes Susan's version of events. His earlier smile now seems like a lie. I don't know what to do. I tried to explain, but Thomas didn't seem convinced. Then I received a message from Nancy. You were a bit cheeky with Mom. After all the effort of moving here, didn't you come prepared? If you're following me here, then you should be a bit more patient. Thomas looked at me as if to say, she should be more patient. Yes, I moved here for Thomas, but it was because I care about him, not just to appease Susan and Nancy. I wanted to be with him, and that was my priority. I looked straight into Thomas's eyes and said, but it's clear that Susan and the others might never like me. Maybe you should consider marrying someone Susan approves of. The word divorce slipped out before I could stop it, and for the first time, Thomas looked genuinely panicked. Wait, hold on. How do we jump to divorce? I just want you to get along better with my family. He didn't understand that his family might never accept me, which baffled me. It seemed Thomas didn't want a divorce, as the next day, he came home late from work. I talked to Mom, he said. She said it was a misunderstanding and apologized. What a fuss. He also mentioned that it was almost Susan's birthday. Thomas suggested, how about celebrating Susan's birthday at a fancy restaurant? If we say it was your idea, maybe Mom's view of you will change. He presented it as a great plan, but I suspected that Susan's twisted nature wouldn't make her genuinely pleased with such a gesture. Still, I agreed to handle the restaurant reservation and invited Nancy and others too. Make it for 7, I said. Thomas agreed, but I was filled with unease. As Susan's birthday approached, Thomas had been acting strangely for about a week, unusually cold and responding to my attempts at conversation with vague, disinterested answers. It felt very unpleasant. I wondered if something was wrong at work, but I would soon find out the real issue. When we arrived at the restaurant, Susan, Nancy, and their spouses were already there. Thomas and I were shown to our table, and a worker glanced at us questioningly, making me feel uneasy. Happy birthday, Susan, I said, but Susan didn't even look our way. Instead, she addressed the group. Thank you all for coming today. I'm blessed to be celebrated by my family. Her deliberate disregard felt like an insult. Nancy looked puzzled. I thought today was a family gathering, she said, glancing at me briefly. Tracy looked over worriedly. I realized then, I was being completely ignored. If that was the case, I'd simply ignore them in return and leave early. Just as I thought this, a worker approached our table awkwardly. I'm terribly sorry, but the reservation was for 6 people today. I distinctly reserved for 7, I said. Was there a mistake? No, it should be for 7, I insisted. That's what I told them over the phone. Oh yes, but about a week ago we received a call to change the number to 6 from a gentleman. The worker explained. I was confused and looked at Thomas in disbelief. Thomas said, yes, please service for 6. Everyone's here now. I was stunned. What? I exclaimed. Thomas turned to me, accusingly. I heard from Mom's side that you've been bad-mouthing our family a lot, saying I don't earn enough, and that I'm insensitive. You really had a lot to say, huh? It seemed that a week ago, when Thomas contacted Susan about the reservation, she filled his head with all sorts of lies. Foolish Thomas, without a doubt, believed her. Angry, he had called the restaurant, pretending to be me, and changed the reservation from 7 to 6. The restaurant, hearing the same last name, didn't question it. How could he be so easily deceived in such a short time? Was he really that gullible? With this realization, I felt that there was no point in me being there. Why was I even invited? When I confronted Thomas, demanding that he apologize to everyone present and reflect on his actions, Thomas did the unexpected. He insisted that I apologize to my in-laws and then go home alone to think things over. Naturally, I refused. I couldn't admit to or apologize for things I didn't say. And I didn't need a husband who believed his mother's side over his own wife. Frustration brought tears to my eyes. Why had I even followed him? Seeing my distress, Thomas began to panic, but it was too late. Susan watched us with a smug smile, clearly pleased that her plan had worked. "Thomas, it's fine," I said coldly. "Next time, marry a younger, more docile daughter-in-law. You might have children then, and you'd be happier with that." Susan's words were sharp and Thomas looked lost, burying his head in his hands. Susan turned to me, saying, "Caroline, why don't you go back to your parents' house? A daughter-in-law is ultimately an outsider. I can't see you as family. You're not charming at all. So please leave quickly." Her triumphant tone stung. "I'd leave even without you telling me. I'd like to see someone who can get along with someone as twisted as you," I retorted and walked out of the restaurant. Thomas's head remained buried in his hands. Tears of frustration welled up again as I hurried away. Just as I was about to exit, I heard someone calling my name. It was Tracy and her husband. "Caroline, wait," Tracy said, clearly upset. I couldn't stand it anymore. "Mom and Nancy haven't changed at all. I knew the gossip about you was false. When I said I was cutting ties, they just told me to do whatever I wanted. I'm sorry about Thomas. He's always been a puppet for Mom and Nancy." Tracy's voice was laced with genuine concern. "My husband's job is finally settling, and we're moving soon. We've decided not to have kids," and about Nancy's side. Just then, my mobile phone rang. The caller ID showed Susan's name, and I thought, what now? As I was about to answer Susan's call, Thomas's name flashed on my phone. "What now?" I muttered. Tracy and her husband exchanged glances. "If you want, Caroline, you might want to go back to the restaurant. You might see something interesting," Tracy suggested before they left, looking satisfied. The phone kept ringing. When I finally answered, Thomas's voice was filled with panic. "Ah, Caroline, I'm sorry. I didn't realize it was a lie." The commotion in the background was chaotic. "It's too late to start over now. I'll send the divorce papers later," Thomas said quickly before hanging up. I tried to end the call, but he pleaded, "Wait, can't you come back? Please, it's a lifetime request." Thomas's childish plea almost made me laugh, but my curiosity about Tracy's cryptic words got the better of me. I decided to return to the restaurant. When I arrived, a crowd had gathered around Thomas's table. Speaking into a microphone was Susan's favorite female announcer. The scene was chaotic. "No, that's not it. We were just... It's a misunderstanding," Susan stammered, clearly struggling for the right words. Thomas and Nancy looked awkward and uneasy. The announcer, holding the microphone, directed the question to Susan. "You loudly said in the restaurant that Caroline is an outsider and should leave. What did you mean by that? Please explain in detail." Tracy's husband, along with the others who had been offended, had left the scene. The whole situation seemed bizarre. I began to understand. This was turning into a spectacle on TV. As I stood there, dumbfounded, I realized I had forgotten to confirm the reservation details. A worker noticed my confusion and approached. The scene earlier had indeed been quite chaotic. It turned out there was a TV recording scheduled at the restaurant that day. Although the dining area was semi-private, conversations were easily overheard. "Sorry, can I have a moment for an interview?" the worker asked. Not long after I left, the famous announcer appeared with a bright smile. Susan was clearly thrilled. "I'm a big fan. An interview?" "Absolutely," she said enthusiastically. The interview's topic was daughter-in-law and mother-in-law issues. The announcer mentioned, "We heard about the heated argument earlier." The daughter-in-law left in tears. What happened? Caught off guard by this unexpected question, Susan and Nancy's faces turned pale. They were clearly unable to discuss the embarrassing truth that they had lied to drive away their son's wife. Thomas spotted me and pleaded, "Caroline, please, I can't let this shame be known." It was all my misunderstanding. He looked utterly pathetic, but I had no affection left for him. I turned my attention to Susan, who smiled and said, "Oh, we usually call each other Carrie." "Ah, Carrie, come over here." I approached silently as she beckoned. The microphone was pointed at me. "You say you call each other Carrie, but how does the daughter-in-law see her mother-in-law?" the announcer asked. "I've never been called that," I replied. "I've been called unpatriotic several times for not having children, though that's due to Thomas and me not feeling ready or confident enough to raise children. We haven't even tried for over 2 years. That's what I was always told was grounds for divorce." I recounted how Thomas had initially supported me when I first got sick and had to take leave from work. I liked his kindness and followed him here, hoping a change of environment might help. But this was the result. I had no more tears left, no more attachment to Thomas. Seeing Susan and Nancy looking embarrassed and pitiful brought me a small measure of satisfaction. I wondered if this would be broadcast nationwide. As I prepared for the broadcast and anticipated celebrating Susan's birthday, I couldn't help but reflect on what a day it had been. Seeing Susan's distress expression, I couldn't help but smile. "Well, since the daughter-in-law is considered an outsider, I guess I should leave. Goodbye," I said, savoring the moment as I exited the restaurant. Despite the shouts behind me, I walked away with a sense of satisfaction. In the end, Susan and her family managed to block the broadcast, so the footage never aired. However, the incident had gained enough attention to become the talk of the town, quickly spreading among relatives and acquaintances. After that day, I returned to my room, packed up, and went back to my parents' house. I sent the divorce papers to Thomas, but they weren't promptly returned. Considering it might be time to involve a lawyer, I was surprised when Thomas showed up at my parents' house. My father, Stephen, handled the situation with a firm demeanor. Thomas offered a heartfelt apology, saying he planned to cut ties with his family and would only believe in me from now on. But his words held little weight now. Stephen, usually a gentle man, was visibly injured. "Why didn't you realize this sooner? What have you done to Carolyn all these years? Just sign the divorce papers and leave," he said sternly. Thomas, with a face full of regret, handed over the divorce papers, written in shaky handwriting. Despite the difficulty in reading them, the papers were processed successfully. It turned out that Nancy was the real cause of their infertility, though she had blamed her husband. Now close to divorce, she no longer had time to visit her in-laws. Thomas returned to his family home, living with Susan in a small town where they likely faced uncomfortable rumors for a while. For me, this was all in the past. After the divorce, I reconnected with a classmate from my hometown, and we married happily. We were soon blessed with a child, and now have a 2-year-old daughter, and am expecting our second. My new mother-in-law is like an angel, so kind and supportive. Life is unpredictable, but right now, I'm living a happy and fulfilling life.